Listen, all you New Yorkers. Excuse me. Taxi.
Okay, man, we're looking around.
This is the 77 WABC minicast.
Back in the old WAAF days when me and Opie were shock jocks up in the Boston area. We made a lot of trips into New Hampshire for gigs and things like that. It was a lot of fun. Back in the 90s, people really have embraced the 90s, right? I think in the early 2000s, because the 90s were still pretty recent memory, the 80s took this place as this wonderful decade. The 80s were a little silly. The music and the costumes people wore. I think the 80s was what the 70s thought the future should look like. The pointy, big shoulder pad things. And like Daryl Hannah in what movie was that? She just put some spray paint across her eyes and it looked all sexy and stuff. Blade Runner. And that was the 70s version of the future was the 80s. And we were pretty prosperous as a country. It was much more difficult to be as divided as a nation back then. Because, I mean, how are you going to piss people off? Put a flyer under their windshield at the mall? It just didn't seem like one person or a small group of people can make such an impact on such a large swath of the country. And obviously, I'm talking about the internet and then the phone and various social media platforms, this instant access where you now have a world stage for what you want to say. And that really divided this country. So the 80s, they were good in that we didn't have that. Things were silly. You know, politically, things got a little crazy with Iran-Contra and Ronald Reagan and nuclear proliferation. But we never felt like our country was failing. We never felt like we were so divided as a country that there wasn't even an America anymore. As a matter of fact, when Reagan came in, he came in on the platform of we are going to bring America back to its former glory because people were really depressed about what Carter had done to America. A nice enough guy, but I mean, he wasn't really a president for a strong, proud America. So when Reagan got in there, you know, we were proud to be Americans. Movies, Rambo, and all those America kicking ass movies. And then what did we have? The 90s. The 90s seemed like a decade where everything was just cool. Everything was awesome. The music was great. We still had this rapport with each other. And the country was still very united, very proud. We had won the Cold War. There was no more Soviet Union. And right up until 9/11, that's really what it seems like. What a baptism into the 21st century that was. Because the 90s are looked at now like the last decade that we were America. Songs come on from the 90s and it takes you to a place and a time and a feeling of being, you know, maybe not being an American, but a girl you went out with, a car you had, friends that you had, things like that. And that's all part of, you know, the America we lived in. And then just, oof. And you notice every decade had a feeling to it and a vibe to it. It was very obviously that decade. It might have taken halfway into the next decade to realize, like it took to get to maybe 92, 93 to realize what the 80s were. And then you're like, oh, the 80s, they were crazy. And then the 90s were the 90s. Very distinct decades. 70s, 60s. It always was that. Have you been able to differentiate between the aughts and the teens and now the 20s? It just seems like this one mush of just horror for this country. No distinction between the decades themselves. It really does seem like that. I don't know. When people go, wow, that was, 10 years ago, 2015. And you go, it just seems like yesterday because there doesn't seem to be anything that made it distinctive or different from 2025, 26. Obviously, technology changes and things like that, but technology changed between the 80s and the 90s. But there doesn't seem to be this distinct decade that we've been living to. And in the past 20, 25 years, it's just been a mishmash of I don't even know what. It certainly hasn't been American.
It's tax season, and at LifeLock, we know you're tired of numbers. But here's a big one you need to hear. Billions. That's the amount of money in refunds the IRS has flagged for possible identity fraud. Now here's another big number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, we'll fix it guaranteed. One last big number. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast for the threats you can't control. Terms apply.